This project grew out of research that I did for the Reckoning radio and podcast series. And as part of that series, one of my key ideas is that I wanted to find descendants of people who were enslaved at Oxmoor, the plantation here in Jefferson County. And I found it was really difficult, really difficult to trace, first of all, to find the identities of any of these enslaved people. And in many cases, all I had to go on was a first name. And that's how most enslaved people, if they appear in the historical record at all, the best we can hope for is we get their first name. And it is not at all assured that they are using the name of the person who enslaved them as the name that they use in freedom, for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is, they might want to choose a name of their own choosing. So I lucked out, and there was one man who shows up in the papers of the Bullitt family, which are housed at the Filson Historical Society, that is mentioned by first and last name. And his name is James Sanders. And he shows up in a memoir written by Henry Bullitt, one of the sons of William Bullitt. And he mentions that he was married to a woman named Eliza Julia. And actually their wedding is described in a letter that's in the papers there. So that gave me a name of a couple, James and Eliza Sanders. And so, and I knew where they were come emancipation. I knew they were in Henderson, Kentucky, because that's where they were taken, as were most of the enslaved people at Oxmoor by the end of the war. So I went looking in the 1870 census in Henderson, Kentucky for James and Eliza Sanders, and I found them. And that is how I eventually got to their descendants that are on this call. And however, I lost track of the family after the 1900 census. They just seemed to disappear. And in particular, I was trying to figure out what happened to James Sanders. And in the world of genealogy, this is referred to as a brick wall. When you can't go any further, there's just no more records that you can find. And brick walls happen a lot in African-American genealogy. They're the rule rather than the exception. However, the way most African-Americans encounter that brick wall is when they're going from the present day backwards in time. And the place where they usually hit a brick wall is the 1870 census. The 1870 census is the first year that African-Americans appear in the census as citizens with first and last names. But it turns out, at least in Kentucky, there is a powerful tool available to break through that brick wall: military records. And not just any military records, but one kind of military record in particular, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So I'm going to share a screen with you here and start to tell you about this. This is the key tool that we're going to talk about. It's a set of ledger books that were kept by the Adjutant General's Office of the U.S. Army during the Civil War, toward the end of the Civil War, to specifically keep track of African-American troops who enlisted from Kentucky and Missouri and possibly other border states, but the only existing books like this that are available to us online are from Kentucky and Missouri. Now, to make matters more confusing, this book that you see before you was miscatalogued by the National Archives, and I don't know how far back in history they miscatalogued it, but it says in the catalog for the National Archives that this is a book of records for Missouri soldiers. So even if you knew such a book existed and you went looking for it in the records of the National Archives or Ancestry.com, you couldn't find it because it's labeled as a enlistment ledger of soldiers from Missouri. So what makes this such a powerful tool? Hold on, I'm trying to get to the next page and it is stuck. Sorry about that. Hold on. Something is going wrong here. Sorry, folks. Here we go. Sorry about that. So what makes this so powerful, and my colleague Patrick Lewis has coined this idea that it's a Rosetta Stone for African-American genealogy. And what he meant by that is, with the information contained in this ledger, we can learn things about these soldiers that we can find in no other place, okay? So this is hard to read, so I'm going to just sort of explain to you what's here. You have the first name and last name of the soldier. You have the place where they're born. You have their age, so we can figure out what year they were born. You can figure out where they enlisted. And this is the really important piece of information. The name of owner if a slave. Name of owner if a slave, okay? So it is very, very, very rare in any kind of record keeping that is kept in this country to have the name of the enslaver and the name of the enslaved and a first and last name that they went by, okay? Now we're going to talk about the fact that this first and last name that they went by in the Army could very well be different than what they went by in freedom. But nonetheless, right here on this page is more information than the average enslaved person is connected to in the written literature. For some reason, I'm really having a hard time. Okay, now there are other ledger books that exist that the military kept that also have enslaver names. So this is an example of one that was kept for men who were drafted into the Army, not those who enlisted in the Army. The first book I show you were those who were enlisting. So this is another group of enslaved people that we have information about. And what they've done for this particular book is they improvised where it says former military service here, it says owner. And so once again, we have enslaver names here that go along with the names of the enslaved. Now, here is how I found this guy, James Sanders. I didn't find him. I went looking for him. I had this idea that maybe he was in the military. He was the right age to be in the military. So I went looking in the military records on Ancestry under the name of James Sanders or Jim Sanders, and I found zero, nothing. And then it occurred to me he was owned at the time by a man named Archibald Dixon, okay? So I thought maybe, just maybe, he would be in the records of the Army as Jim or James Dixon. And bingo, I found him in this book, Jim Dixon, and it says A. Dixon, owner. So that tells me it was definitely the right man, okay? So the next thing I did is went looking for his military records. And so I had the name of Jim Dixon. And interestingly, he added a middle initial of S for Sanders, which is the name he actually went by, okay, which may have been the name of a previous enslaver at one time, because it says here he was born in Tennessee, so we can assume he had a previous enslaver before he came to Kentucky, okay? Now this is the next most important piece of information that is contained in military records for African Americans, pension cards. If somebody survived the war, okay, they may very well have applied for military pension when they became available in 1890. And so I went looking in the pension cards, which are all digitized. 100% of these are available online. And I looked again. So now I looked for James Dixon, right? Because I know he's going by the name of Jim or James Dixon. And here it says James Sanders, known as James S. Dixon. So imagine, if you will, I'll jump ahead and tell you that I checked it out with FamilySearch.org, which is one of the largest genealogical entities in the world. And they ran a query of their database of these pension cards and found 99,000 pension cards that have two names. And I went looking through these. I looked at about 50 of them randomly and found that of those 50, about 90% of them were African American. So that tells me that there's anywhere from 75 to 80,000 potentially soldiers who served in the US colored troops who went by a different name in the Army than they went by in freedom. And this is really, really important, because if you're an African American, for instance, who knew that your great-great-grandfather was a James Sanders, you wouldn't know to go looking for Jim Dixon in military records, or for that matter, in any kind of other records during the slavery era, unless you find this card. And this card is like your decoder ring that helps you understand the names that these enslaved ancestors went by. And it also shows us the name of his wife at the time, Elizabeth Dixon. It turned his first wife died in childbirth, apparently, or shortly after childbirth, and he remarried a woman named Elizabeth. And now the next most interesting piece of information here is we know that they were living in Kentucky at the time when he filed for his pension, but at the time that he apparently died, they were living in Indiana, IND. Okay, so armed with this information, I was able to order a pension file for James and his wife. Okay, because the soldier could get a pension for being an invalid if they had any kind of wounds left over from the war, and then when they passed away, their widow could get a pension. So this is an example of the kind of information you can find in a pension file. Okay, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but what it says is rheumatism of arms and shoulders and scurvy and disease of back. So when I got this pension file, I shared it with the descendants of James Sanders, and one of them, Russ Bolds, suffers from a rare form of cancer. And the way it manifested itself initially for him was pain in the arm and shoulders and back. And when he looked at this, he thought, wow, it looks like he had the same problem I have. So this is the kind of information that white people might have passed down through oral history or paperwork or letters or journals in their families, to know that there are certain conditions that are congenitally passed down from generation to generation. But very few Black families have this kind of information available to them. Also in this pension file is a marriage certificate for this couple, James Sanders and Lizzie Williams. And it tells us where they were married, and it tells us the names of their witnesses. So that's another important piece of information for us. And in this file was essentially a death certificate for Mr. Sanders. And it lists where he was living at the time when he died, which is the Marion branch of the National Home for Disabled Veterans. And so I went looking online, and I found that there is a cemetery, a military cemetery right next to this, essentially a retirement home for disabled vets, and gave that information to Russ Bolds and his sister Lisa, and Russ was able to find the gravestone. And what you need to know is that Russ has been a diligent genealogist for decades, since he was a kid. And he has been to this cemetery, he told me, going up and down the aisles in the cemetery, trying to find the grave of his ancestor, because he had been told by his grandfather that they had an ancestor who fought in the Civil War who had a grave in this cemetery. But he could never find him because he was looking for James Sanders. But there he is. The military sprung for the headstone, but under the name he served under, Corporal James S. Dixon, 118th USCT. So there are a bunch of different kinds of resources that are available to research Kentucky soldiers once you have this key information that's contained in these ledgers. So we have the ledgers themselves, and there's these enlistment ledgers, including one that has recently been found at the Kentucky Historical Society that has been scanned but not indexed, so we don't know what's in it exactly. Then there's these draft ledgers that I showed you. There's the military records that I showed you. There is a death register, which I'll show you in a moment, which is really important because once you start to look at large numbers of these soldiers, one of the first things you want to do is find out if they survived the war, because there's no point looking for a pension card if they died during the war. So that's an important resource. Then the pension cards and the pension files, which we talked about. And just a note about the pension files, they are not free, they're not digitized, they're not available online. You have to pay money to get it from the National Archives, and it's not cheap. So that is an impediment for a lot of African Americans who maybe have limited means to be able to spring for that. The censuses, the 1870 census, all the way up to next year, the 1950 census will be available online. Then there are slave schedules. A lot of people don't know about these, but starting in 1850, the US government wanted, probably for taxation purposes, I'm really not 100% sure what inspired them to do this, but they started to separately keep track of the number of enslaved people on a separate schedule on the census. And we're going to show you examples of what that looks like in a moment. Then, once you know the name of the enslaver, which once again, you would not normally know about African Americans. But in this case, for these soldiers, we do know this information. And so then there are paper records pertaining to the enslaver. There are wills, there are deeds, there are estate settlements, baptismal records. Okay, and a lot of that stuff is online, not so much the baptismal records, but the others are. Then you can go looking in newspapers, in both Black newspapers and mainstream white newspapers. You can look in church newsletters, other kinds of documents that are online. So just to prove to myself what you could find out about a soldier just from what's on that ledger, I picked a man at random. Trying to get to the next screen. For some reason it's stuck. Okay, hold on, let me go backwards. Okay, I picked the very first person on the first page of the first ledger whose name I could actually read. And it's David Adams, okay? And it says that he is born in Mason, Kentucky. He's 25 years old. He enlisted in Greenupsburg, Kentucky. And his enslaver, Nancy Moran. And then I happened to notice right underneath him, another man with the same name, same last name, Isaac Adams, 19 years old, owned by the same person. And so I thought there's a high probability these are brothers. And from everything I've been able to find out since, they are in fact brothers. And by the way, this is not at all unusual. I have found at least 3 sets of brothers just from the first handful of soldiers I've researched who enlisted with a brother into the Army at the same time on the same day. So I went looking for David Adams's military record and found it. Okay, it's hard to read, but this is definitely our guy. He's born in Mason County, and he's definitely the same man. Also, we know what military unit he served in, the 100th USCT, and that matches. So then I wanted to see, did he make it? Did he live through the war? And there is an index on Ancestry and also available elsewhere of all of the specifically United States colored troop soldiers who died during the war. So we can check this index. And in this index, it's hard to read, but it has the name of the person, when they died, what they died of. And there's also information that we can eventually look for their gravestone, where they were buried. That's in a separate set of a separate database. So I determined he didn't die, he lived. So I was able to find a pension card for him. Now, because of COVID, the National Archives is closed. I think they're still closed. So I was not able to go look for his pension file, but I was able to determine from this card that he was married to a woman named Elizabeth. And I was able to determine that he applied for his pension early in 1885, and he must have died right around May of 1901, because he certainly couldn't have died any later than this, because she's applying for a widow's pension. And I note that she's in Kentucky, okay? And so now I know he survives the war. I can go looking for him in the census. This is hard to read, but he's right here in yellow, David Adams, laborer, and he's living in a boarding house. Now, let me go back. In the 1880 census, he is now married and he has 3 children, Hattie, Henry, and David Jr. Now, for those of you who are genealogists, you will know this, but for the civilians in the group, most of the 1890 census was destroyed in a fire. However, if you're a veteran, you show up in a special veteran census. And it's very hard to read, but right in the middle is David Adams. Right there, David Adams. Then in the 1900 census, they have even more children. They have a total of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. And then remember, his wife applied for a pension, a widow's pension in 1901. So I went looking in the newspaper in Maysville, Kentucky, in Mason County, and lucked out and found an obituary for him. Mr. David Adams died yesterday at 8:15. And this is a couple of days before she applies for a widow's pension. And then I was able to find him in Find a Grave, and someone took a picture of his gravestone in the cemetery at Maysville. So that's an example of what you can learn about the soldier. And then armed with this information and what's contained in those various census records, you can start to follow the family down through history. And I was able to do just that and put together a family tree. And I was able to follow the men. So his son, David Jr., and then David had a son named Richard. And then Richard had a daughter named Mary Julia, and she married this man, William Alexander. And they have 4 children who are still alive. And I was able to contact one of them who lives in Louisville. And I invited to be here tonight, but I don't think she showed up. Her father had done significant genealogical research. She had done significant genealogical research, but they were never able to learn much about their enslaved ancestor, David Adams, other than he existed. And he had a brother named Isaac, who you see here. And they were never able to learn who was his enslaver until, again, I had this information from the ledger books. Now, speaking of enslaver, this was my first opportunity to, just armed with nothing other than the name of an enslaver from a ledger book, to try to go see what I could find out about them. So I used deductive reasoning to figure out that Nancy Moran was listed as the enslaver, which means probably her husband died between the 1860 census and the 1864 time when these enslaved men joined the army. But I was able to find them as a couple in the 1850 and 1860 census. And then, and by the way, just a note here, they're quite wealthy. So I did a quick check, and this is about $500,000 worth of wealth between their real estate and their personal estate. And personal estate, when you're a slaveholder, is nearly always the value of the enslaved people, okay? So I went looking for the enslaved people. So here's the 1850 census, and there's 6 enslaved people, okay? And one of them is exactly the right age to be our soldier. And he's right here. Sorry, wrong person. He's right here, 12 years old. That's exactly the age he should be, David Adams. And then we jump ahead 10 years to 1860. The number of enslaved people has doubled. And we have a man who's exactly the right age here, give or take 1 year, 23 years old. I'm pretty sure that's David right there. And then his brother would also be here. And I believe this is his brother right here, one of these 2 15-year-old boys. Now, another treasure trove of information that's available for once you know the name of the enslaver are wills, deeds, and estate settlements. Now, in the case of the Morans, I was not able to find any wills or estate settlements, but I want to show you some examples of what they look like, okay? And these are left over from the research I did for the reckoning into the Bullitt family and the Chenoweth family, because those were the 2 families I was researching. So on the left, you'll see Alexander Scott Bullitt's will, which he made which came into play when he died, and I think it was 1816. And it just as an example, that it goes on for pages because he had just shy of 100 enslaved people that he gave away to his various heirs, but he starts with his wife. And right here, you can, and they're always, at least in this particular case, they're broken down by family units. So you see Jenny and her 4 children, Bob, Molly, Stafford, and Matthew. So that gives us some, if you wanted to go looking for this family, you could start to, use these first names at bare minimum to start putting together family units. So this is an example of an estate settlement. In this case, this man did not leave a will. So his estate was probated, went through the courts, and somebody had to go through all of his belongings and assign them value. So that included human beings. And so this is page 1 of his list of enslaved people. Tillman, Polly and her daughter Angeline, Jim, Sidney, Fanny, and how much the courts decided they were worth circa 1857, I think, when he died. Now, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here for a second. In the past couple of weeks, I was interviewed by an African-American journalist whose name is escaping me, who is she told me before we did the interview, she said, if you ever find anything out about my direct ancestor that was in the United States colored troops, I would love it, if you would share that with me. So she gave me his name, and I went looking for him in these ledger books, and I found him, and I found the name of his enslaver. And I did a quick check, and this man, his name was Montgomery Greathouse, and his brother Moses Greathouse escaped from their enslaver, who was a man named Joseph Greathouse, who lived in Nelson County, Kentucky. When we did our phone call, this interview, she explained to me that she is the 3rd cousin of Muhammad Ali. And so Montgomery Greathouse was Muhammad Ali's great-grandfather. And that his wife lived into Muhammad Ali's life. And there's a picture of him that she sent me with his brother and their 99-year-old great-grandmother, who was still alive to see him win the heavyweight crown. So that sent me down a rabbit hole of wondering what kind of records might exist if the enslaver were Catholic, okay? So I was not actually able to find any baptismal records or marriage records for anybody associated with Joseph Greathouse. And I think this is because he was affiliated with a different church than what is available online. I was able to find online records for exactly one church in Nelson County, and that's St. Catherine's, which is located in New Haven, Kentucky. And so I have spent the past couple of days looking through these baptismal and marriage records, and they are chock full of enslaved people, okay? And this is an example. I just did this over lunch today. Over lunch, I was able to do a quick search by name, and I was able to find 6 children born to the same couple, James and Mary. James, who was enslaved by William Norris, and Mary, who was enslaved by Michael Spalding, okay? And there's all their children, Mary Emily, Rebecca, Amanda Francis, Anne Maria, James, and Stephen, okay? So then I thought, I'm going to go look in the 1870 census and see if I can find a man named James, and I'm going to guess Norris, married to a woman named Mary. And I know some of the names of these children. Bingo. 1870 census. It's hard to read. There's James Norris, Norris James, his wife Mary, James and Stephen, and then a bunch of other children who were born after the church records ended, the period where the church records I had ended. I was not able to find a marriage record for this couple, James and Mary, in this particular set of ledger books or record books, but I did find dozens of other enslaved couples who were married in the church by a priest, and it clearly lists them in a very similar way. It'll say James, servant of, or usually it just says James of William Norris and Mary of Michael Spalding, and it'll have the date of their wedding and who officiated the wedding. So it occurred to me as I was doing this research in the past couple of days that if you looked specifically at soldiers from the Catholic counties of Nelson, Washington, and Marion counties, not to mention Jefferson County, where you have lots of Catholics in the antebellum era, that you could do an enormous amount of research just looking at those soldiers who were Catholic. Because now, again, with that pension record information, we know the name that they went by in freedom and the name they went by in the Army. And we have all of these detailed records from the Catholic Church, and combined together, you could conceivably take these baptismal and marriage records all the way back to, in all likelihood, Maryland, where they came from originally, these families, and maybe go all the way back to the 1600s or the early 1700s when these families first came over to the United States from the British Isles. So I'm just putting a bug in the ear of anybody on this call who might ever want to pursue this, that there could be powerful kinds of research done using these Catholic records. All right, now I'm going to go down another little rabbit hole here. This man here on the right is one of a series of men who had formal pictures taken at a photo studio in Rock Island, Illinois, that have survived to the present day. And they all happen to be members of the same military unit, which was mustered in Louisville. And so these are all people who were enslaved in Jefferson County for the most part. And two of them are another set of brothers, Manuel and Joseph Taylor. And Patrick Lewis was just telling me that the Filson just recently bid for the photograph of this man's brother that was up for auction at an auction house. So I went looking in the military records of these guys because I was just curious who these men were. And by the way, on the back of all these pictures, it has their name. So I knew it was Manuel and Joseph Taylor. And I looked at these pictures and I thought, these guys have to be the same. They have to be brothers because they look so much alike. So I went looking in their records and I found something I hadn't seen before. So it's a pre-printed form where a doctor would basically take a medical history from each of these soldiers. So so we would have all sorts of information, again, that could be useful for African-American families today about health problems that their ancestors had. We're starting to go over time, so I'm going to whiz through here. Another thing that was in this particular set of files is something peculiar to the border states of Kentucky and Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., is that if you could prove that you were a loyal supporter of the Union and that you had owned a man who joined the Union Army, theoretically, you could get $300 per enslaved man who joined the Union Army. So a bunch of people filled out all this paperwork to try to get money, okay? And to the best of my knowledge, this guy did not succeed, but nonetheless, in the back of this, this soldier's records, hold on, sorry, is a bill of sale attesting to the fact that this man bought these soldiers. And it mentions by name Emmanuel and Joe. And that's Joseph and Emmanuel, the two men that I have pictures of. Now, why is this work important? So enslaved people were considered chattel property. So legally, they were akin to livestock, okay? And so white people did not keep track of enslaved people's names unless they had a good reason to doing so. And it almost always had to do with money, inheritance, lawsuits, bankruptcy. Even after the Civil War, many archives did not keep track of what little information survived. So I have been told anecdotally about archives around the country who had information about enslaved people, and they didn't bother indexing it in their catalogs because they didn't have last names. So they didn't know what to do with that. Similarly, there are churches through the 20th century and into the 21st who have published baptismal records, but they left out the Black families. And again, they said it's because they don't have last names and they can't index them. My thinking is part of reparations should be making amends to African-American families for the loss of this information about their ancestors. And that if this information does exist, it should be made freely available to African-Americans. And that's the big idea of this project. So what we want to do is we want to start now in this summer, and hold on, and through the next academic year, to research a group of 230 soldiers from Jefferson County that exist in these various ledgers with enslaver names. We've already reached out to area schools, and there are a group of people that we're going to be interviewing who are student interns. We've also reached out to adult genealogists involved with the African American Genealogical Group of Kentucky that are going to research each of these soldiers along the lines of what I did with David Adams. Okay, we've been talking with FamilySearch.org, again, one of the largest genealogical groups in the world. They're going to give us access to all of their documents, all the censuses, all the military records, all the pension cards, and they will give us essentially sort of a backdoor access to their database so we can create family trees for all of these families and make them freely available at no cost to African American families so they can look through them and see if maybe any of their ancestors are there. We're going to publish all this research in a searchable database on our project website. We're also going to work with educators here in Jefferson County to create free curricula for K through 12 schools, public schools, Catholic schools, independent schools, using the lives of these enslaved men who fought in the Civil War as a jumping off point to research the African American experience in slavery and after slavery. We've come up with a budget for this pilot project of about $150,000. We're actively looking for donations for that. You probably saw that coming, but just thought I'd mention it. Now, our overall goal for this project, so this is over and above what we're going to do in the next year, is to research the approximately 15,000 soldiers that exist in these enslavement and draft ledgers for Kentucky, for whom we have enslaver names. That's out of a total of 23,700 soldiers from Kentucky who served in the Civil War. Because we know about a quarter of the people who served in the war died, and African Americans died at a higher proportion because of disease, we're guessing roughly 10,000 survived the war. It has been estimated that for each one of these men, they could have left 1,700 descendants. So if you do the math, that's 17 million people alive today that may descend from just this group of 10,000 soldiers. So ponder that for a second. How powerful an impact this project could have on a huge diaspora of African Americans who descend from these soldiers in Kentucky. Okay, so we want to publish all of this online. We're going to perpetually maintain it so that even 50 years from now, it will be accessible. We're also going to back it up to archive.org, which is massively funded from Silicon Valley money. We're also going to put all this information, all these family trees on FamilySearch and Ancestry. So the many African-American descendants out there who've already done genealogical research can easily find this and connect it to their family trees. We want to provide all of this data to scholars from various disciplines, historians, African-American studies, women's studies, sociology, economics, especially African-American scholars. There's a potential here for all sorts of kind of collaborations with writers and visual artists, playwrights. We've talked to some people maybe about the idea of trying to separately raise money for a memorial with all these 27,700 names of USCT soldiers. But at the moment, this is all just kind of a pipe dream, awaiting funding. We have grant applications that we're putting out in the coming months to local and national funders, but we are most definitely looking for support at any level. If you want to make a tax-deductible donation, you can do so at the link that's up on the screen. And I know I've gone over where I said I was going to be, but we've got 10 or so minutes left and would love to take some questions. So I'm going to ask Val to unmute herself and lay some questions on me.
Well, and Dan, I quite a while ago somehow got dumped off my Zoom, and so as I came back in, I'm no longer co-host. But I still can read the chat. I think there was a question that probably got answered in the chat on the baptismal record. There's a SPON. Could you, with a name, could you you just explain what that is?
Can you say that one more time, please?
It's
Oh,
on the
SPON.
baptismal records?
Yes, 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 yes.
As
Sponsor.
sponsor?
Sponsor is a synonym for godparent.
Yeah.
So every person has to have at least a godmother, apparently, in these records. So it's usually a female enslaved person who is the godmother.
All right. Are there any other, Emily, I think you asked a question about things being misfiled to protect enslavers. I'm not sure what the these references. Do you want to ask that question?
Hi, everybody. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you thought that there was some element of protection involved in this sort of losing of this information all these years.
Yeah, so I'm always hesitant to ascribe intent to people I don't know. But I think it's entirely possible that somebody might have made a decision along the way that, oh, let's let dogs lie, sleeping dogs lie, and that there's no need to have too much information in the public record. I don't know this for a fact. I really can't speak to that. But if someone did do that, it certainly wouldn't surprise me.
So Dan, could you speak a little bit about why the pilot is limited? Claire, why is the pilot limited to Jefferson County? And just make sure we understand the difference between what the pilot is supposed to accomplish versus the Kentucky-wide project.
Sure. So the idea is that we want to truly have a demonstration project, okay? We want to demonstrate to ourselves and to future funders, major funders, how much time it will take to research each one of these people. On average, does it, especially for the people who survived the war, and we have, pension files and different things to look at. So that's number one, is just, we need some raw data to be able to figure out how long it takes to do this work. But also, unto itself, we wanted to look at one particular community, and it made sense to start here where we're based in Louisville, to have as comprehensive an idea as possible of the experience of the soldiers from that particular community. So it has a twofold value. To the larger project, because we eventually want to research all 15,000 of these men, it gives us real world experience with how complicated is it to, for instance, train student interns to be able to read 19th century handwriting easily. How much time does it take for people with different kinds of backgrounds? So we're purposely going to be picking up some different students with different backgrounds to do this work, undergraduate students, graduate students, adult genealogists, and to see how quickly or slowly they do the work. So I hope that answers the question.
We have a question about whether the recording will be available.
Yes, absolutely. So everybody who's on this call will automatically get an email tomorrow. Well, they're not going to automatically, they will get an email tomorrow. Everybody who registered for this will get an email with a link to where they can see a video of it. And then you can share that with anybody you wish.
And then Shirley Harmon is pointing out that along with the legal records of wills, deeds, its receipts, et cetera, that a lot of the enslavers had personal letters going back and forth, and that's a rich source, might be in historical societies. Maybe you can mention briefly the research you did around the Bullitt family.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And and forgive me, I had intended to cover some of this, but I was rushing along to make sure we had some time for questions. The historical societies in Kentucky, so the Filson, the Kentucky Historical Society, the UK has significant holdings. Some of the other schools have significant holdings that are relate to their respective parts of the state. Like Berea has a bunch of stuff pertaining to their part of Kentucky. And in many cases, the wealthiest families in the Commonwealth bequeath their family papers to one of these archives. And yes, it's absolutely true that, for instance, I would not have been able to find Bridget and Russ and their siblings, if I had not been able to find these papers that were left by the Bullitt family, they were kind of pack rats. They kept all sorts of books. So I see a question here. I'm able to look at the chat. It says, where are the ledger books kept and how can we access them? So they're in different places. They're not under one roof, and they are mislabeled. So one of the goals of this project is that we want to get digital copies of all of these and put them all online on our website so that they are all under one roof, so to speak, and you can find all the information there. But right now, they are some of them are on Ancestry, but not all of them. Some of them are on Family Search, but not all of them. Like Ancestry has half of them, sort of, and Family Search has half of them. The library, the National Archives has some of them, and apparently they don't even know whether they have the others of them, even though they probably do, but they don't have them in their catalog. So it's the darndest thing. I've been corresponding with an archivist at the National Archives, and he can't tell me what they actually have, just because of the arcane way that they catalog their stuff. Before I answer the remaining question, I had intended earlier, I pointedly asked Bridget Johnson if she would join us tonight. And at the very beginning of the call, I didn't see that she was on the call, so I didn't introduce her. But this project really grew out of an interview that I did with Bridget and Russ, her cousin. And I asked them, it was in direct relationship to the idea of reparations. And I asked them, I'm going to stop sharing screen for a sec. If there were going to be reparations in this country, what would be meaningful reparations to you? And I'd like to ask Bridget to come off mute and explain what she told me, if she's still here. Bridget, are you still here? I see you. There
Yeah,
you are.
I'm here.
Yeah, could you just
I'm
speak
here.
for a
Can you hear
second
me?
to why you think this kind of information is valuable to you as an African American woman?
Well, from when you asked me before about the reparations, my answer was, everybody talks about 40 acres and a mule and, big check and things like that. But when I began my research or searching for my family, the biggest thing was the expense of records. You have to, pay for birth certificates, pay for death certificates, everything, you can only get so much for free. And it's very expensive, it's very time consuming. And I felt that part of when I look at the country or the world and everything that's happened to different groups of people, the Holocaust and everything like that, like the Jewish community, they get a huge stipend every year for that. I mean, in the millions. And you look at the Asians, you look at every culture that has anything has ever happened to them, they are getting something. African American people or African people, Black people, whatever you want to call them, they don't get anything. There's nothing. I feel that part of the reparations should be, as Dan, you mentioned about the information being free. That to me, that's fine. But I believe that part of the reparations should be that the US government should pay for any Black person in this country to find who they are. Because I feel like my people are the only ones that cannot trace back to where we came from. I can say I had a hard time identifying myself as African because I don't know that I'm African. Just because my mother, James Sanders, my great-great-grandfather, just because he was African, I wouldn't have known that none of this. And that's horrible because everything of our people was erased. Our culture, our name, everything about us was erased when they were brought here. And I feel that this government, this country owes that to any Black person in this country that wants to trace where they came from. And I think they should pay for it. It shouldn't come out of our pockets.
All right.
Because we didn't ask to get, our ancestors did not ask to come here. So I don't feel like it's something that we should have to pay for. I think that should be part of the reparations.
And so I just want to make it 100% clear that a key tenet of this project is that all of the information that we are going to research will be available for free. It will never be behind a paywall. It will always be accessible at no cost, and that you will not need an Ancestry subscription to get at it. You will not need, we are one of the, if we can raise the money, one of the things explicitly that we want to do is to get the pension files for all of these soldiers. And as I showed you in my presentation, these pension files alone have so much rich information that could be of value to African-American families. And those cost at minimum $30 or $40 to get. That's just to get the most basic of them. And I think to get all of it, it's like $60+ dollars. We're going to try to work out some deal with the National Archives, either to give us some kind of cut rate deal, or we'll just hire someone to go to the National Archives and do all of this scanning so that we'll have access to it. And we'll put all of those records on our website and make those available to African Americans all over the country. It is
Dan,
just
you
about
wanna address
7
the
o'clock.
last question? Yeah, can you just in 1 minute address Andrew Baskin's?
Andrews, yes, and I will follow up with you on this, Andrew. He's asking what roles are we expecting our advisors to have, and how many student interns will be hired. So we are planning on hiring 4 student interns for this summer who would be working over the 12 weeks of the summer, because they have the summer off, and they're often looking for internships for the summer. So we're talking about working with 4 of them this summer. And then for this larger project to research all 15,000 of these, it's going to require an enormous number of people working in a team effort kind of way. And we've already been talking to several schools, and we most certainly hope that Simmons will do this as well, to work with students during the academic year who would do some of this work for academic credit, perhaps get work study credit for doing this sort of work. When I was a student, I needed to do work study jobs to get my financial aid. And I remember scrambling with my school to get a job. And my hope is that we might be able to work with schools around the state in that respect as well. So a combination of paid internships, especially in the summer, students working for academic credit, students working for work study credit, and adult genealogists, such as the folks from the African American Genealogical group, that would be paid for their time. And I'm aware, a little after 7 o'clock.
Yeah, and I just want to I just want to wrap this up by thanking you all for participating. If you know anybody else who is interested in this project, who maybe didn't get the invitation, wasn't aware of it, or couldn't make it, please let us know, either me or Dan, and we will make sure they get a recording. If any of you are interested in knowing more about the project in particular, and helping us raise the funds that we need for the pilot in particular, again, please reach out to me or Dan. And maybe we'll be able to keep you posted as we go and as the project rolls out. Dan, anything else you want to say at the end?
I don't think so, and I'll sort of leave up the final slide that has the contact information.
Yeah, good idea.
Well, I'm trying to do that. Let's see. Let's try that again. Yeah, no, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. I know it was a lot of information to impart in a relatively short period of time. Oh, and there was one final question that Brian Hackett posed, and that is whether only students from the Jefferson County area are going to be involved with this. The answer is definitely not. We've already gotten resumes sent to us from a couple of students from Western So by all means, it's not too late if you have students there at Northern that want to apply, but it'd be good if they did it very, very soon. Contact me, in the next few days, send a resume, and they can send it to the address on the screen.
All right. Thanks, everybody, very much.
All right, thank you, Val, for taking such good care of the presentation, and thank you all for coming.